50 miles north of London was a hidden city seemingly untouched by war. This was Station X. Here they had found a way to break into the Germans' code machine, the Enigma. Never before had one country known so many of its enemies' secrets. But in 1942, the codebreakers were forced to admit that just when their help was needed most, they were defeated. The future of Station X and of Britain was in peril. Breaking the German naval enigma, the most difficult code of all, had enabled Station X to pinpoint the positions of German U-boats lying in wait for British convoys. In 1941, within a few weeks, the British had sunk every one of the submarine supply boats. Admiral Dönitz was alarmed. Had someone betrayed the Enigma code to the British?
Es gibt eine Geschichte, wo Dönitz mit seinem engsten Mitarbeiter, Admiral Gut, gesprochen worden ist. Diese Sache wissen nur wir beide. Und wenn alle anderen Möglichkeiten ausgeschlossen werden müssen, dann ist einer von uns der Verräter.
On February the 1st, 1942, Hut 8 began receiving U-boat intercepts that gave them cause for alarm. Dönitz had changed the U-boat code. Station X could no longer read the messages. Their allies, the Americans, were not pleased.
Well, unfortunately, the British lost control of the Enigma, and America was left without the kind of vital information needed to protect its convoys. There were an awful lot of protests, and England was very hesitant to tell us that they had lost control of the code.
The British were trying to conceal the truth. German U-boats in the Atlantic could now do their worst. Station X could no longer find them. They had no answer to the new code. Allied shipping losses began to rise. Dönitz had acted on his suspicions. The German Navy had changed the Enigma. They had added a fourth rotor. The revolving rotors, with their maze of constantly changing electrical wiring, were the secret of the Enigma. Introducing a fourth one increased the odds against breaking the code dramatically. Station X called the new code Shark. After 6 months without any breakthrough, the Americans were getting restless.
It got to the point where by mid-1942, the Americans declared that no matter what, they would go their own way and make sure they'd get their own independent capability against the German submarine menace and its code systems. And it became quite touchy as to whether or not the two sides would cooperate.
The Americans were threatening a takeover. Station X could become mere spectators in their own game. Something had to be done. The director of Station X traveled to Washington for a tough meeting. To keep the Enigma code-breaking at Bletchley Park, there would inevitably be a price. A deal was hammered out. American codebreakers were to be sent to Station X. The British had given away the family silver, and there was still the problem of the fourth rotor.
What I think bothered us most was the destruction of the merchant shipping and the destruction of the naval ships. And knowing that if only we could break this wretched code, we could save so many lives and sink so many U-boats.
In October, captured U-boat code tables arrived at Station X and provided the first real chance of getting back into the naval enigma. With these tables, the codebreakers were able to uncover a weakness in the four-rotor system. When the Germans designed the four-rotor Enigma, they realized that it might have to communicate with other stations which used a three-wheel machine. So in one of its 26 positions, the fourth rotor did nothing. The new four-rotor machine became, in effect, an old-fashioned three-rotor Enigma. Station X worked out the settings of the first three rotors on the bombs, just as in the past, then simply ran through all 26 positions of the fourth rotor until they found the right one. Soon, the day's settings were on their way to America. After 10 months in the cold, Station X was back.
The excitement when we got back into the U-boats was terrific. I was on night shift and somebody came running and said, "We're back into the U-boats." And it was the one that was meant we were going to be able to go on getting into the U-boats. So that was terrific. It wasn't just a one-off, it was we were going to be able to do it steadily. Churchill was told as soon as possible. It was a great moment.
Once again, Station X could help protect the convoys. But then, Station X stumbled across an alarming secret. They were no longer alone. The Germans had their own codebreakers too. The most effective unit reported directly to Dönitz, the B-Dienst. They had been struggling for over a year to crack Allied Naval Cipher 3, which was used for routing the convoys. This cipher used number substitution for the phrases of a message based on a set of tables. The Germans, assisted by captures of their own, had been able to reconstruct the entire table.
They could decrypt, for instance, the departing signals of the harbor captain with the whole composition of the convoy. They could decrypt many of the routing and rerouting signals, and they could decrypt the daily situation, U-boat situation reports of the British Admiralty.
Both sides now knew their enemy's secrets. B-Dienst and Station X were playing a deadly chess game, each cancelling out the other's moves. Decoded Enigma messages gave the game away. Station X realized they contained information that could only have come from the Germans reading the Allied cipher.
They approached Captain D.A. Wilson, who was in charge of cipher security at the Admiralty, and asked him to change the cipher immediately, which he did not do. He argued over months that followed that the cipher was too widely distributed. It was impossible to replace it. It would take a long, long time to do. Well, Bletchley Park was beside itself that Wilson would do nothing about it.
It took the Admiralty a full 6 months to change the cipher. In that time, it's anyone's guess how many British sailors' lives were lost because of the delay. But fortunately, in 1943, the U-boat menace was nearly over. The Royal Navy and Coastal Command, armed with radar and direction finding, now had better trained crews and improved tactics. They were taking control.
By May 31st, Dönitz had been totally defeated in the Atlantic. And Dönitz recalled almost all of his boats from the North Atlantic, and the U-boat fleet never recovered after that defeat.
The way was now open for the invasion of Europe. 3,000 miles away, another invasion was going ahead. A year after the deal had been made, the first American officers were being selected to go to Station X, the price exacted by the United States for its cooperation.
I remember vividly, a group of us were convened in a room there, and the moment we came in, they were told, what you're going to hear today is something you will not discuss, and it means that you will never be put where you can be captured by the enemy. And I was picked to be the commanding officer of that outfit, and that's how I got to Bletchley Park.
The journey to England involved a bizarre cover story of being pigeon experts in signals, and also being checked out by an American unit who had never heard of Station X.
They asked us whether we'd had the Army General Classification test. They said they couldn't find our scores on our records. They said, would you mind taking the test? And we said, no, we don't mind. There were 5 of us. And so we took the test, and this sergeant graded them, and he came running out. He says, holy mackerel, what scores? You guys ought to be in intelligence. I don't think I'd ever met an Englishman in my life until that point. I don't know, I had been full of stereotypes about the English, and they're distant and have no sense of humor. And these were the most outgoing, wonderful people, fed us when it was quite a sacrifice. Just enough screwballs to be real fun.
It was the first time I'd ever been involved in my life in any serious discussion, both either about war or politics, with an American. It was there that I learnt for the first time to drink tomato juice. It was the first experience I had with American coffee and American bacon. So that in a way, America was introduced to me through this Bletchley prelude.
Against all predictions, the Americans fitted seamlessly into the life of Station X. The only rancor was to come on the field of sport when the Americans challenged the British to a game of rounders.
We said, of course, we were delighted, you know, our honored allies. So the Americans came, and we showed them how they could play with it. They said, what, no baseball bat? We said, no, we would just use this broom handle. So they said, fine. We played, it was a lovely day, we all played well. And at the end of the game, we all sort of clapped each other on the back, and the Americans said, well, we're sorry we beat you. And the British captain said, I'm sorry we beat you. And that was a little bit of an incident, because the Americans said they thought they'd won, and we said we knew we'd won. And they said, well, what rules do you play by? And we said, our rules.
But in the days to come, the Americans were about to learn of a secret even bigger than Enigma. Station X had discovered that the Germans were using a mysterious cipher machine, far more advanced than even Enigma.
Now, we knew nothing about this cipher machine. It was kept completely secret by the Germans. And we first began to intercept radio transmissions in 1940. It was actually a group of policemen on the south coast of England, and they were listening for German agent transmissions from within the UK. Of course, there weren't any because we'd captured all the agents, but they were still listening for these, and they heard these weird signals, and they sent them to Bletchley Park.
Station X now faced a new challenge. Hitler had demanded his own cipher machine, something faster and even more secure than the Enigma. Hitler's experts had devised a coding system based on the teleprinter machine. Teleprinters use binary code. It's not secret, it's used worldwide. But what the Germans had done was to connect the teleprinter to a machine which cunningly exploited the teleprinter language itself to produce their code. The secret German coding machine was called the Lorenz. It used 12 rotors to scramble the message, not just the 3 or 4 of the Enigma.
The Lorenz machine transmits a string of letters, each one of which is actually a mix of the real letter of the real message and a piece of machine-crafted gobbledygook, that a machine being of diabolically complex craftiness. So at the end of it, what comes out and goes over the ether and is transmitted is a single string of total gobbledygook.
The Lorenz relied on a mathematical system called modulo 2 addition. This allowed the string of meaningless letters added to the message at one end to be removed from it at the other by the same mathematical process.
The operator presses a key on his teleprinter. That generates an electrical signal. The Lorenz machine then adds an obscuring character to this signal, and the result is then transmitted. At the other end of the link, another Lorenz machine set to exactly the same configuration regenerates exactly the same obscuring character, adds it back to the ciphertext, and by the magic of modulo 2 arithmetic, they cancel out and leave you with the plain text.
The security of the Lorenz depended on the fact that it was adding a string of random letters to hide the real message.
But because it's a machine, it can't generate a completely random set of letters. It's what's known as pseudo-random. Unfortunately for Germans, it was more pseudo than random, and that's how it was broken.
Station X gave the mysterious code the name Fish. They could work out that it was based on teleprinter language. How to strip off the obscuring code was anybody's guess. But on the 30th of August 1941, a lazy German operator gave the whole game away.
When he got to the end of keying in this nearly 4,000 character message by hand, the operator at receiving end sent back in German the equivalent of, "Didn't get that, send it again." And then, like idiots, they both put their Lorenz cipher machines back to the same start position. And then he began to key this long message again.
Ironically, the message need never have been sent. The operator was simply doing a test. Resending the message was allowing Station X to break Lorenz. The codebreakers could begin to see the different ways that the machine was adding random letters to the same message.
Now, if it had been an automaton and used exactly the same keystrokes, then all the interceptors would have got would have been 2 identical copies of the cipher text. But being thoroughly disgusted at having to send this message all over again, he started to make differences in his keystrokes.
Changing just one keystroke, even abbreviating a word, meant that every letter from that point on would be encoded differently by the Lorenz. Station X now had 2 versions of the same message to compare. As they knew the underlying text was exactly the same, they could then add the different letters together to separate the real message from the coded letters superimposed over the top of it.
For me, the real excitement was this business of getting these two texts out of one sequence of gibberish. It was marvelous. Never met anything that was quite as exciting, especially since you knew that these were vital messages.
Hitler and the German High Command never suspected that the Lorenz had been broken.
It was an important link. As with a lot of important links, a lot of the stuff which was sent over it was absolute trivia. I mean, asking for more tins of baked beans, except I'm not sure they consumed more tins of sauerkraut, say. But it also sent some extremely sensitive and valuable information about troop movements.
It had taken Station X 3 months to break fish. And remarkably, they had worked out the mechanics of the Lorenz itself, a machine they had never seen. They even built their own machine to imitate it. As it was dealing with fish messages, they called it Tunny. Once the Lorenz settings had been found, Station X could use Tunny to turn the messages into plain German. Teams of codebreakers were needed to attack the Lorenz, but it was still taking weeks to break a single message, and by then the information could be useless.
It was a curious life. It involved mental gymnastics, and it could be very wearing, particularly if you didn't succeed. I mean, you could spend nights in which you got nowhere at all. You didn't get a single break. You just played around through this bleak, long night with total frustration. And your brain felt literally raw. Your psyche, or whatever it is, felt frustrated, but your brain almost literally felt raw at the end of it.
But the whole process was about to be speeded up. At the GPO's research station in Dollis Hill, London, Station X found a brilliant young telephone engineer to help them. He believed he could build a machine that would do much of the codebreakers' work for them. The machine would be nothing less than the world's first programmable computer.
I tried to tell Bletchley Park what my ideas were, but you must understand that the technology that I was using was only just known to very few people in the whole world.
Flowers came to Station X and was convinced that the answer lay in valves, hundreds of them.
Tommy Flowers started in March 1943 with a blank sheet of paper, never been done before. I mean, Flowers was thinking of a machine with 1,500 valves in it. The biggest machine ever at that time had 150 valves in it, so this was an enormous leap into the dark. But Flowers was convinced he could make it work, and nobody else was, but he was. And so he started, more or less off his own bat.
We just told people to do things. We had the power, we had the authority to tell anybody, you know, we had the first priority in the whole country for everything. And we could just tell people what we wanted and not tell them what it was for.
Just days before the invasion of Europe, Tommy Flowers installed the world's first programmable computer. Before the final victory, there would be 10 of them dealing with the secret messages of the High Command. They were given the name Colossus. Colossus could read a coded message at high speed and then search for the teeth patterns and settings of the Lorenz code wheels, and it could do this in minutes, not weeks.
Tommy Flowers realized that it was possible to read paper tape optically at very high speed, and this is going at 5,000 characters a second, 30 miles an hour that tape goes through there. And it's quite incredible that it can actually read information at that speed.
In fact, we did a test on how fast we could drive it before the tape broke, and we got up to nearly 60 miles an hour. So we decided that was a bit... when it did break, it went all over the place. It just disintegrated.
Colossus was now ready for Operation Overlord, the biggest invasion the world had ever seen. Tanks and guns choked every main road, every street in southern England. The Allies were intending to deceive Hitler about where the invasion would take place. They planned to make the Germans think that an attack on Normandy was simply a diversion. Through double agents, the Allies leaked the word back to Berlin. It would be up to Station X to see if the deception was working.
The Germans were deceived for a very long time, far more than we expected and far more successfully. But we also got a bonus, if you like. That is, we knew they were deceived. Because from Ultra we could see that they were not moving troops into Normandy. They had to say to themselves, they'll pop over to Calais. The Germans were not only deceived, they were known to be deceived.
For Overlord to work, the Germans had to be fooled by the false messages and even a dummy army. Around the clock, Station X was hunting for the merest hint of German suspicion. June 1944. The invasion was poised to strike, but then Station X received a message.
Just before D-Day, Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was appointed Inspector General of the Western Defenses, and he sent this enormously long message, very detailed description of the Western defenses, where each unit was located and what equipment they had. It was 70,000 letters, which was read.
When Station X decoded the fish message, it contained alarming news for the Americans. They were planning to parachute their troops into Normandy. They thought they had chosen a safe landing site.
They were going to drop one of the airborne divisions right on top of a German tank division. They would have been massacred. They changed it.
June the 4th. Reassured by the codebreakers that all was well, the massive army began to move forward. But there were to be other, greater forces at work that even Station X could not predict.
We went on duty that night, and they said, well, tonight is the invasion and they're going across. And so we slaved away. Well, of course, as everybody knows, by about 4 o'clock in the morning, the weather was so bad, they had to bring them all back, which of course was bad luck for us, because they then came and said, well, you can't go walking about Bletchley when you know that the invasion's going to be tomorrow night, so we just had to stay there.
24 hours later, with the simple words, "Let's go," Montgomery launched the biggest military invasion in history.
We had dinner, and we came out at 11 o'clock, and I suddenly started to hear a hum, and it got louder and louder and louder, and I knew what it was. And about 10 minutes later, the sky was black with aircraft towing gliders. And my friend said, I wonder what that is. And I said, I haven't the faintest idea.
And about 3 o'clock, I think it was, suddenly there was a real rustle. And very shortly the word spread that there had been German traffic saying that paratroopers were dropping all over the place. So we knew this was it.
messages coming into Station X were showing that the deception plans had worked. Hitler's troops, split between Normandy and Calais, were unable to counter the onslaught. Over half the German forces had remained in the north, awaiting the Phantom Army. At Station X, those in the know about what was going on had been kept incarcerated for 48 hours. Even now, nobody was taking any chances.
We staggered out feeling rather the worse for wear, but knew it was then general knowledge, and went home, and my lady I was billeted on said to me, "Where the bloody hell have you been?" And I said, "Well, I've been working." She said, "Well, you've missed all the fun." And I said, "What fun?" And she said, "Well, there was the invasion. It's been on the radio," because no television. "It's been on the radio." I said, "Oh, lovely, you know." And went to bed.
Tuesday, 6th of June, 1944. Invasion began. 10 a.m. breakfast. Letter from Maureen. Spent morning washing and ironing. On at 4. Life quite hectic. Feel somewhat anticlimaxy. Now the second front has begun. Not a bad day, really.
It had not been a bad day for the codebreakers either. They had accurately foretold the position of all but 2 of the 62 German divisions. Enigma and fish messages were read throughout Operation Overlord. The German High Command, the troops in the battle, had all unknowingly been speaking with the enemy. In the months that followed, Station X would continue to chronicle the disintegration of the Third Reich, right till the end of the war. Colossus had become another weapon in the codebreakers' armory. It had moved codebreaking into the computer age and given a taste of wars to come. But it could have other uses too.
If you were lucky, you worked at Colossus. Colossus was the one warm spot in the British Empire. It had 4,000 vacuum tubes or something, and it gave off a lot of heat. And so everybody wanted to be next to Colossus, particularly on the night shift, because they were saving power.
Sometimes, for the Wrens, Colossus, with all its complexity, could be reduced to becoming the most expensive clothes dryer in the world.
Working through a hot summer day or a hot summer night, to my astonishment, these Wrens had stripped down to bras and knickers. And you must remember, this is before bikinis were known, you know, when bathing costumes were one piece. And for a young man to see a room full of girls stripped down in bras and knickers really was the most extraordinary experience. They never sent me there again. I don't quite know why.
With just a few hundred men, surrounded by several thousand young women, events took their inevitable course.
She was one of a gaggle of nubile Wrens.
All of them gorgeous except me.
Oh, you were all right.
It was all right. No, the other Wrens thought he was absolutely wonderful. Oh, Mr. Wiley this, oh, Mr. Wiley that. Couldn't see what they saw in him.
My husband was in Bomber Command, and I met him at a dance. I'd been married for about 5 weeks when he was posted missing in operations over France. and he gave as his next of kin my father rather than myself, which I thought was very thoughtful, because he didn't want me to get the telegram.
The telegram was premature. Her husband had survived and had been hidden by the French resistance.
The first I knew was when he telephoned me. He'd phoned up the Red Officers' Mess and they thought they recognized his voice. And when I answered the telephone, I mean, I was so overcome that I had to hand the telephone over to one of the other officers there to make arrangements about going to see him. But it was a wonderful moment.
I came off leave and I went to pick up my post, and there was a man sitting at a desk at the end of the room in an RAF uniform, and I thought, I'm going to marry that man. We didn't speak, or I wasn't even introduced to him. We'd had a row, and we leapt onto the train just as it was moving, and he said to me, you know it's over. And of course, I was absolutely devastated. I stared out at the fields that were passing, and I said proudly, yes, I know. And he said, I'm in the war. And it was, you know, I didn't think, my God, the war's over. How wonderful. I thought, how marvelous. It's not over between us.
When the final signal came through from Dönitz surrendering, it was in clear and not in code. And that was extremely interesting because you felt the war was then really over. When messages did begin to come through in clear, then all the secrets of the war really were beginning to fade into history already.
In the roll call of those who had brought about victory, the name of Station X would never be mentioned. Britain's best-kept secret was to stay a secret for the next 30 years.
After the war was over, Churchill wanted all these machines dismantled so that nobody knew we'd ever had them. It was part of the job to make sure that nobody knew what we'd done.
We pulled everything apart, everything, all the drums, all the bits of wire, everything, and just put them into a dustbin. And all the menus, everything were torn up. Everything was destroyed. There wasn't a scrap left. Churchill had ordered it, so we thought that must be right.
Churchill was hiding the fact that Station X had cracked the Enigma codes. The German machines were now in use around the world, and Britain wanted to go on eavesdropping. Churchill even spirited away some of the technology to serve in the Cold War.
I opened a little cupboard and found myself looking at 6 Enigma machines and had a terrible moment of wondering whether this would be the souvenir of all time and how I could actually sneak this off the premises. But brainwashed that I am, I eventually handed them all over.
Even Colossus was to be destroyed. It was to be smashed up and buried.
That was a terrible mistake. I was instructed to destroy all the records, which I did. I took all the drawings and plans, all the information about Colossus on paper, and put it in the boiler fire. Saw it burn.
Tommy Flowers returned to the post office and was forgotten. In all the secrecy, Colossus never received recognition as the world's first programmable computer. Instead, the honors were to go to the Americans.
I had been in Chicago about 3 years by that time, and the first computers came out. And I remember my next door neighbor saying, "Have you heard about this thing, this machine that will do all these sort of things?" And I said, "Yes, I read about it in the newspaper." She said, "I guess they wouldn't know much about it in England. England's rather behind, isn't it?"
The people dispersed, some back to universities, some into the fledgling computer industry, some to the organization which was to succeed Station X, GCHQ. The most famous alumnus of all, the man whose inventiveness had been at the center of Bletchley Park's success, died tragically. In 1954, Alan Turing took his own life after being persecuted as a security risk because he was homosexual.
Alan Turing's interest from 1943 onwards is to do with the formation of his plan for the electronic computer of the kind that we all use now, the general purpose computer. Because his pre-war work in logic had really given the idea of this, but Bletchley Park turned logic into practicality, and Turing was the very first to see that this could be done for the computer as we know it today.
For 30 years, what went on here remained Britain's best-kept secret. Gradually the huts fell into disrepair and decay. One by one, the codebreakers died, taking their secrets to the grave.
We had taken a vow to secrecy, and I never discussed my experiences at Bletchley with anybody. When I got married in 1955, I never mentioned anything that I'd done to my wife, except that I had been at Bletchley Park during the war. So that occasionally when we met somebody at a party and they said, "How's Hut 6?" she would say to me, "What was Hut 6?" And I would never tell her. We were inured into this rule of secrecy.
Until 1974, when in what most saw as an act of treachery, the secret was revealed by a former Station X official.
Well, I was like everybody else. I mean, we were sort of distraught with Winterbottom, whom I remember incidentally. He was very good looking. He'd sweep into Bletchley Park. He was an Air Force officer with his coat draped over his shoulders, and we'd say, "Oh, Group Captain Winterbottom," they'd say. Little did we know what he would do to us.
I read the book review in full, this book by Winterbottom called The Ultra Secret. That shouldn't be in the paper. I folded the paper up and put it under the chair. And I sat there for a minute and I said, "Oh, you silly ass." So I said to my assembled family, "Would you like to know what Mommy did in the war?" Of course, the next day my husband rushed out and bought about a dozen copies of the book, and passed them out. "This is what my wife did in the war. I know what the secret is now."
Well, it's really been appalling for us to have things spilt out, when we knew that we were not going to be talking about these things for the rest of our lives. Horrifying.
And embarrassing.
And embarrassing.
You never know what's supposed to be known.
I mean, D-Day came out within 2 hours or so, because the biscuit.
Station X was that most British of institutions. Gifted and often eccentric amateurs muddling through, and against all the odds achieving great things. Despite their enforced silence, it was a time that few of them can ever forget.
I remember how cold it was. Absolutely cold. Do you remember the mittens? It was absolutely freezing on night shift.
We had a tip-off that really, if you can get read out before breakfast.
One didn't realise the funny little skills one had. My daughter went to work in the Bodleian Library in the holidays, and she said, "Oh, I'm on J floor, Mummy." And I said, "Gosh, 10 floors down." She said, "How do you know J is 10? So I said, "Oh, don't you?" And then I realised that everybody didn't know that M was 13 and W was 23 in the alphabet, and so on, because we were so used to turning numbers inside out. One didn't realise that that was just part of your life.
Another thing I remember, for some reason I was sent over to Hub 4, which in those days was the naval section, to get a document. And they said, "Oh, we can't give you that. Anything we send over to Hut 8 gets lost." We can't give you that.
It was absolutely a landmark personal experience, no doubt about it. And I think virtually every American who was involved at any level felt roughly that way. And I've never matched it since. I've worked with fine people on interesting and important projects, but nothing that gave the total personal satisfaction that Hut 6 did.
The whole war completely altered our lives. And so obviously Bletchley Park was part of this. Because the last war was the biggest social revolution that's ever been in England. There's no question about that. I mean, life totally changed. For the people down below, greatly for the better. And for the people at the top, well, they just had to do something for change. It was jolly good for them.
Station X had changed the face of the 20th century. The first computers had been invented here. The special relationship with America had been born here. Signals intelligence was created here and would become the way all wars would be fought in the future. In the end, though, Station X's greatest achievement will lie not in broken ciphers, but in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives it saved.
Historians generally agree that it shortened the war by 2 years. Bletchley Park didn't win the war. That was won by people with guns and bullets and things out in the field. But I think Bletchley Park is a great exemplar, particularly to the younger generation now, of brains over bullets. You can defeat an enemy intellectually, and that was shown here.